1832. Ice wrote in the log. The crew only copied. In 1832, the ship Victory wintered hard in Felix Harbor, nailed into Prince Regent Inlet by a vice that called itself ice. Her experimental engine sulked under canvas. Paddle wheels learned the grammar of stillness. Scurvy had not introduced itself yet, but it had sent a letter. The purser issued a small sealskin diary to able seaman Elijah Price, a blank meant for weather, rations and thoughts fit to survive officers' eyes. By morning, the first page was written without ink. Faint script feathered across the fibers in hoar frost, letters raised like breath on a pane. The words named no hand. Price touched a line and it dissolved back into glitter. He copied what he could with a pencil that broke at 30 below. Men laugh the way men laugh in white places. The surgeon called it capillary fancy. The captain, who had learned to listen to materials, told Price to keep the book dry and the joke quieter. At night, the cabin breathed needles. Boots grew the beards of old men. Somewhere on deck, a line twanged like a harp string trained by cold. Price scratched the ordinary log. Pemmican and biscuit, oil too thick for lamps, tea that tasted of iron. Then in the morning found a second hand had annotated his entries in frost. Weather finer than felt. A crack in the flow he had not listed. A name he did not know. E.S. repeated where his own should be. On Sundays, men built little churches of talk. A Netsilik hunter visited with his family, trading seal for saw blades, showing a sledge runner polished with river ice and soot. He tapped the compass and smiled without malice. North, his gesture suggested, is a thing that moves. Needles were gifted, lessons in snow were given back. That night, the aurora came down low enough to make a sound like silk being folded. The diary's edges glittered where breath had signed it. Price wrapped the book in flannel, set it beneath his pillow and slept as if guarding a small stove. The stove, however, dreamed on its own. Noon was a rumor that year. The sun rolled its coin along the horizon and refused to pay. Compasses slouched as if embarrassed. The needles north wandered like a dog that remembered another house. The officers tested time with sand and shadow, while the mate read the sky with a face that did not forgive. Price, who owned only the ordinary senses, found the extraordinary one in paper. The diary frosted a map at dawn, thin lines of rime linking Felix Harbor to a small mark shaped like a nail hole on the land. Under it, 3 letters breathed and faded. E.S. Magnetic North lies on the ground, the captain said later, recalling the party that had planted a flag upon it last summer. It seemed a useful sentence and a treacherous one. The men set a cairn anyway and named the wind. Inuit visitors came and went through the white door with the good manners of experienced neighbors. They taught the ship to sit correctly in snow, and the snow to forgive careless boots. A child traced the diary's stiff cover and laughed. The frost writing did not appear while she looked, as if language respects guests. During a calm, the ice spoke. A low cathedral groan answered by a pistol crack racing away underfoot. A black lead opened beyond the beached paddle. Ink poured into a white page and closed again after supper. In the night, something heavy thumped the hull once, as if reminded where to knock. The watch found only a seal's bright hole and a ring of breath frozen into lace. Price wrote that he had dreamt a man standing in the companionway with crystals blooming from his beard. In the morning, a frost hand had underlined his note twice and added, "Go light." The surgeon said, "Dreams borrow the ship's noises and spend unwisely." Still, the sledges were repacked, tins relisted, buttons moved from metal to bone because metal burns. When the Aurora returned, it wore a yellow seam along its green, the color of brass, left too long in cold. The diary did not explain. It rarely did. By March, the talk had acquired a destination that sounded like promise and threat: Fury Beach. There, men said, the wreck of HMS Fury had coughed up stores years ago, and the beach still kept a memory of canvas and biscuit if a party were stubborn enough to ask. The captain chose 12. Price went, diary wrapped under his shirt because the cold writes through pockets. They dragged boats on runners over a geography made of decisions. Snow hissed. The way to Fury was written in more than charts. On a morning blue enough to ring, the diary showed a neat list in hoarfrost: flannel, spirits, engineers' tools, nails, spare stoves. Price had not written it. Neither had the purser. The letters beaded as breath and then vanished into damp, leaving only the order in the men's heads. At noon, a gust lifted sugar plumes from the surface, and the air smelled of tallow. They reached the wreck site as light ran out. Timbers like black ribs, caches snowed over into domes, a boat from Fury sleeping in its drift as if the crew had stepped away and would return after tea. The night pressed the tense canvas until it hummed a low note. Someone woke to the sound of ladles and found the kettle still. Someone else dreamed of nails sorted by size. At first light, they opened a cache and drew out tins stamped with a year that already felt older than the men who touched them. Pemmican unrolled. Bread came out in rectangles that remembered oceans. Spirits uncorked with a votive hand. On a board torn from the Fury, Price rubbed the diary's frozen edge and watched letters condense for an instant. ES beside a small arrow, pointing not home, but sideways along the coast. They loaded what they could bully into obedience. Snow freshened. In the white, the men made a hallway with their bodies so the boat could pass between. A gull crossed the wind and left. The shore darkened where a lead opened. The arrow seemed to mean, not yet. The engine, meant to argue with wind, learned in winter to argue with hunger instead. They stripped it of its dignity. Valves for paperweights, copper for kettles, a length of shaft polished into a runner. Paddles that had been history's experiment became walls for a snow house at the bow. The boiler, cleaned to an honesty it had never known at sea, offered heat to hands too cracked to applaud. Victory made small music. Iron ticked, ice sang its long vowel under pressure, and sometimes the flow tolled a bell no church would admit, deep and patient, as if a struck world were answering itself. On nights when the aurora stitched and unstitched the sky, the diary gathered a film of frost writing like marginalia. Small corrections to yesterday's figures. A reminder to move the oil, a question about a man who had not sailed with them. ES, repeated as if someone were practicing a name. The surgeon kept the scurvy ledger, gums beginning to whisper, legs that grew opinions about walking. Price shared his lime with a man who would not last and watched the diary record that act with a single word, given in letters so faint they needed breath to appear. The captain rationed talk of spring like sugar. He spoke of lanes that open in June where whales forget themselves, of a southward corridor that once admitted boats and might again. The Inuit of visitors nodded or did not. Weather outranks language. One afternoon, the ice burst a pressure ridge beside the ship with such authority that men cheered. The lead opened toward the south for 30 yards, then closed its jaws, a mouth reconsidering. In the brief mirror of water, they saw a dark shape drift beneath, not seal, not timber, not anything they could name without waking superstition. That night, the diary's frost formed in a torn ring on the page, like the echo of something heavy that had chosen not to say itself aloud. Price closed the covers and set the book by the boiler. It warmed, but the ring did not melt. In May, the ship ceased pretending. Pressure made ribs speak in a language even officers obey. Orders came quiet and exact. Stores sledged ashore, boats dragged onto the floe. The Union flagged and then folded. They left the Victory housed in snow, a chapel for iron, and walked away over a country that preferred no traffic. Price wrote a sentence he had not intended. Farewell, like writing to a person, and closed the diary on it as if to keep the word from escaping. The route to Fury Beach turned men into engines. They leaned into traces. They learned how to be ice with feet. A pale sun paced them. Wind carved verses across the sastrugi. The boats answered with their own complaints. At each halt, the diary set down their numbers with an accuracy that startled the mate. 12, then 11 recovering, then 10, and one carried. Under the figures, frost sometimes drew a row of short marks like small boots, and then, at a distance, a second row. Longer strides. Keeping pace, blown snow made a theater of the plain. Once, in a white so complete that breath felt loud, silhouettes assembled at the edge of vision and stood as sailors stand to receive orders. The men looked, counted, and found the muster included 2 hats that no longer had owners. Snow makes ghosts generous, the surgeon said, which is a good sentence and a poor cure. That night the diary wrote a single hoarfrost arrow across the page toward a low break in the land. In the morning the arrow persisted where all other writing had sublimed. They reached Fury Beach thinner than their shadows and found the old caches again, chastened. The boat from the wreck looked ready to work after a prayer and a wrench. The sea beyond the bar kept its slow arithmetic, the long swell under the skim that thinks it is forever. Price drank hot lime in a tin cup that burned kindly and opened the diary to warm his hands. The page was empty. It felt like a pause, not an end. From Fury, they made the coast their teacher. South along a broken grammar of leads and pressure walls, west when lanes permitted, always testing the ice with a spear that answered like a tuning fork. Whales breathed in the dark underfoot. Once a white bear watched from a ridge as if evaluating seamanship. The boats learned sledging, then water, then sledging again in a stuttering catechism that offended no priest because there were none. The diary resumed its manners. Frost notes in the margins. Mind the crack, share the fat, lash the oars flat, each line appearing before the order was given. Price stopped showing the pages to anyone but the surgeon, who wrote the phenomenon down because that is what surgeons do when they cannot dose it. A gale found them in a small bay that never made a chart. Snow buried the boats and then returned them. They sang work songs without words to keep their teeth from interesting themselves in bleeding. At night, the sky rolled green tapestries. Between their waves, the diary sometimes carried a single word, faint as a remembered oath. South. Once it wrote two, even fainter, almost there. ES appeared again in letters so thin they resembled scratches, then halos where letters would be if breath had the patience. Price asked quietly on watch if any man aboard bore those initials. None did. The surgeon suggested the page was remembering someone left behind by the century. By late summer, the ice lost its authority. Water announced itself with a sound like coins poured in another room. Men's faces reassembled into earlier versions of themselves. Far off, on a horizon that had learned to be blue, a sail showed like a claws promising rescue. They burned wet rope to make smoke and beat pans because gunpowder had become valuable in a different way. The diary added no frost that night. It merely cooled in Price's hands like metal forgotten in shade. They were taken up the following year by a ship whose name deserves a toast. Boats were lifted aboard like statements finally believed. The men ate too much and then learned to stop. Sleep arrived and argued with memory. The engine parts they had turned into domestic gods became conversation, then ballast, then rumor. Price kept the diary in a tin and said little about it except that the pages never stayed blank as long as cold remained within reach. In London, years later, a gentleman persuaded him to part with the book for a sum that paid old debts and bought new teeth. The diary traveled into a cabinet, then into a case, then into a museum where breath is managed by machines. Visitors read the neat pencil and the stains of tallow and try not to fog the glass when they lean. On some winter afternoons, a ghost of writing appears, corrections to dates. Small arrows toward later chart changes. The initials ES once, brief as frost on a latch. The label is modest. It mentions Ross and the Victory, Felix Harbor and Fury Beach, the abandonment in 1832, and a rescue that confirmed stubbornness as a maritime virtue. It does not mention the bell under the ice or the ring that would not melt from a certain page. It cannot name ES. In the archive, a conservator keeps the book in a sleeve and swears she sometimes feels cold reach through cloth when she touches the spine. She believes this privately and records nothing of it. If you stand before the case on a cold day, you may see a faint line bloom along the margin like hoarfrost finding words. It will dissolve when you lean closer, as if paper dislikes witnesses. No voices, only the soft air of vents, a slow tick that no object admits, and the sense of a corridor left in the world for men who once went south by reading what the cold wrote.